4 men emerged from the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night. They weren't tourists. They weren't soldiers. They carried explosives, fake identities, and a mission to destroy America from within. Their targets were factories, railroads, bridges, and power plants. If they succeeded, America's war machine could be crippled before anyone even knew they were there. Everything was going exactly as Hitler had planned, until the man leading the mission made a decision no one could have imagined. Just days after landing in America, one of Hitler's own Nazi saboteurs picked up a telephone and called the FBI. Four men came out of the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night. They carried explosives, delayed fuses, false identity papers, thousands of dollars in American cash. They had crossed the ocean aboard a German submarine, and they had come to destroy America from the inside. Anything that could slow the American war machine. They were not soldiers arriving in uniform. They were Nazi saboteurs, and within a week, the man leading them would do something almost impossible. He would call the FBI. June 1942. The United States had been at war for only 6 months. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in the country's memory. Along the Atlantic coast, cities practiced blackouts. Ships disappeared beneath German submarine attacks. People watched the ocean with fear because the war no longer felt distant. It was moving closer. Across the Atlantic, Nazi Germany faced a growing problem. Germany had conquered much of Europe. Its armies had won battle after battle. But America had entered the war, and America was building. Car companies were becoming tank factories. Shipyards were launching cargo ships at incredible speed. Factories were producing aircraft, guns, ammunition, engines, steel, and supplies for the Allied war effort. Germany could win battles, but if America kept producing weapons faster than Germany could destroy them, the war would eventually become impossible for Hitler to win. Old, new identities, and wait for the moment to strike. The 8 men were divided into 2 teams. One would land on Long Island near New York City. The other would land in Florida. Once ashore, they would bury their uniforms and equipment, change into civilian clothes, travel by train, disappear into the country, and begin destroying targets connected to the American war effort. On paper, it was a terrifying plan. Agents, 2 submarines, explosives already inside the United States, and a country still adjusting to the reality that war had reached its shores. But Operation Pastorius had one weakness. The man chosen to lead the Long Island team, George John Dasch. Dasch had lived in America before the war. He spoke English. He understood American life. He knew how easily a man could disappear in a crowded city. But somewhere before the mission began, Dasch's resolve had started to crack. Maybe he believed the operation was too ambitious. Maybe he feared it would fail. Maybe he had lost faith in the cause. Maybe he simply wanted to save himself before someone else exposed the mission first. No one can know exactly what he was thinking. But by the time he reached the American coast, Dasch was already becoming the most dangerous threat to Hitler's plan. Not because he carried explosives, because he carried doubt. Just after midnight on June 13, 1942, the first German team came ashore near Amagansett, Long Island. Dasch led the group. They wore German uniforms during the landing. If they were captured on the beach, they hoped they would be treated as prisoners of war instead of spies. But once they reached shore, the uniforms had to disappear. The men began burying them in the sand, along with explosives and evidence of the submarine waiting offshore. The beach was dark. Fog moved across the dunes. The men worked quickly. They believed they had landed unseen. Then a young Coast Guard recruit appeared out of the darkness. His name was John Cullen. He was only 21 years old. He was on patrol with a flashlight and a flare gun. At first, the scene made no sense. Men standing on a beach in the middle of the night, some in civilian clothes, some in bathing suits, one dragging a heavy bag from the surf. Cullen approached and asked what was happening. Dasch answered quickly. He claimed they were fishermen from Southampton. Their boat had run aground. It was a simple story, but it did not feel right. The men did not look like fishermen. Their equipment did not look normal. And then one of the men spoke German. Cullen realized something was wrong. He asked what was inside the heavy bag. The answer came back, but Cullen knew the area, and he knew the story was nonsense. Dasch understood that the Coast Guardsman was suspicious, so he reached for cash. First $100, then more. Forget what you saw. Walk away. Say nothing. For a moment Cullen appeared to accept. He took the money. He promised he had seen nothing. He told Dasch he would not recognize him again. Then he slowly backed away into the fog. The saboteurs believed they were safe, but Cullen was not leaving to disappear. He was leaving to run. He raced back toward the Coast Guard station. He reported everything. The strange men, the cash, German voices, the heavy bags, the story about fishermen and clams. Within hours, Coast Guard personnel returned to the beach. The saboteurs were gone. They had reached a train station and traveled toward New York City, but they had left evidence behind. German uniforms, explosives, incendiary devices, false identity papers, American cash. The quiet beach on Long Island had become a crime scene. Nazi Germany had landed saboteurs on American soil. The Coast Guard had discovered the invasion, but the FBI now faced an enormous problem. 4 trained agents had escaped into New York City, a city of millions, a city full of hotels, train stations, factories, shipyards, apartments, crowds, and strangers. The men had money, false identities, and a mission that could unfold anywhere. And the Long Island landing was only half the plan. A second German team was still preparing to come ashore in Florida. 4 days later, on June 17, another group landed near Ponte Vedra Beach, south of Jacksonville. This team was led by Edward Curling. With him were Werner Thiel, Herman Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. Unlike the Long Island group, they landed without being confronted. They buried their uniforms and sabotage equipment. Then they made their way inland. They reached Jacksonville, boarded trains, and began separating. 2 headed toward Chicago. 2 went toward New York. Now there were 8 Nazi saboteurs inside the United States, and the FBI was hunting them across a country at war. But while the FBI searched train stations, beaches, hotels, and city streets, George Dasch was making a decision. He had escaped Long Island. He had reached New York. He had seen how close the operation had come to disaster. He knew one of the men had already supported the idea of confessing, Ernst Berger, and Dasch knew that if the FBI found him first, he might be treated exactly like the others. Nazi agent, an enemy operative, a man who had landed in America with explosives. So on the evening of June 14, Dasch called the FBI's New York office. He used one word, Pastorius, the name of the operation. He said he had recently arrived from Germany. Then he told the FBI he would contact headquarters in Washington. To the person receiving the call, it sounded unbelievable. It could have been a hoax, a prank, or an attempt by German intelligence to confuse the investigation. But the call was recorded, and the name was remembered. 5 days later, Dasch reached Washington, D.C. He checked into a hotel. Then he called FBI headquarters. He referred to his earlier call. He gave them his location. This time, the FBI did not hesitate. Agents went to the hotel. Dasch was taken into custody. And once he began speaking, Hitler's entire operation started to collapse. Dasch gave investigators names, descriptions, possible locations, travel plans, details of the landing, details of the explosives, details of the mission. The FBI was no longer searching for an invisible enemy force. They were hunting specific men, in specific places. The arrests came quickly. On June 20, the 3 remaining members of the Long Island team were arrested in New York City. Ernst Berger, 3 men who had stepped onto an American beach carrying explosives only days earlier. Now they were in custody. Then, on June 23rd, Curling and Teal were arrested in New York. 4 days later, on June 27, Neubauer and Haupt were arrested in Chicago. All 8 men were captured. Not one major factory had been destroyed. Not one railway bridge had been blown apart. Not one power station had been attacked. Not one of Hitler's intended targets had been reached. The operation had required submarines, training camps, explosives, false identities, more than $175,000 in cash, and it had collapsed in barely 2 weeks, not because of a massive gunfight, not because of a secret code cracked by intelligence analysts, not because American soldiers stopped the operation on a battlefield. It collapsed because a Coast Guard recruit refused a bribe, and because the leader of the mission decided to call the FBI. But arresting the saboteurs created a new crisis. What should happen to them now? They had been arrested on American soil, New York, Washington. Civilian courts were open. Judges were working. Juries existed. The Constitution was still in force. But President Franklin Roosevelt believed this was not an ordinary criminal case. These men had arrived from enemy territory. They had landed secretly by submarine. They had buried their uniforms. They had changed into civilian clothes. They had carried explosives. And they had planned hostile acts inside the United States. Roosevelt considered them unlawful enemy combatants. He ordered a military commission, a special wartime tribunal. 7 Army officers would decide the case. The trial began in Washington on July 8, 1942. It moved at astonishing speed. The prosecution argued that the men had broken the laws of war. They had not entered America openly as soldiers. They had crossed from enemy territory in secret. They had discarded their uniforms. They had planned attacks while disguised as civilians. The defense raised a question that went far beyond the 8 men sitting under guard. Could the president take people arrested in American cities and remove them from civilian courts while those courts were still open? Could a military tribunal decide their fate? The case reached the Supreme Court. It became known as Ex parte Quirin. The court heard arguments during its summer recess, and on July 31, it ruled that the military commission could proceed. The justices concluded that the charges involved violations of the law of war and did not require an ordinary civilian jury trial. For decades afterward, lawyers and judges would return to that decision because it raised questions that never fully disappear. How much power should a president have during war? When does national security override normal legal process? And what happens when fear pushes a democracy to act faster than usual? For the 8 saboteurs, the legal arguments ended quickly. On August 4, all 8 were found guilty and sentenced to death. But George Dasch and Ernst Berger had helped expose the mission. Attorney General Francis Biddle and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover urged Roosevelt to spare them. Roosevelt agreed. Dasch's sentence was changed to 30 years in prison. Berger received life imprisonment. The other 6 men received no mercy. On August 8, 1942, they were executed at the District of Columbia Jail. Less than 2 months after the Long Island landing, Operation Pastorius was over. After the war, Dasch and Berger remained in prison until 1948. Then President Harry Truman granted them clemency on one condition. They would be deported. They were sent back to Germany. Dasch did not return to America as a hero. He did not receive a medal. He did not become a symbol of victory. His story was too complicated for that. He had agreed to join the Nazi mission. He had trained with explosives. He had crossed the Atlantic on a German submarine. He had landed on American soil with enemy agents. Those facts never disappeared, but he had also made a choice. He called the FBI. He gave them the names, locations, mission, the evidence, and he helped stop an attack that could have brought fear and destruction to American cities. So what was George Dasch? A Nazi saboteur? A traitor to Germany? A man driven by conscience? A man driven by fear? Maybe he was all of those things. But Operation Pastorius was supposed to be a story about sabotage, submarines crossing the Atlantic, Explosives buried beneath American sand, Nazi agents hiding inside American cities. Instead, it became a story about trust. Hitler's planners had prepared explosives, false identities, and submarines, but they had not prepared for the leader of their own mission deciding he would not carry it out. Wars are often remembered through enormous images. Tanks crossing borders, bombers filling the sky, warships firing across oceans, cities burning in the night. But some of history's biggest turns happen quietly, on a dark beach, inside a hotel room, at the end of a telephone line. The Nazi saboteurs reached America. They landed on its beaches. They entered its cities. They carried the tools to attack its war machine. But before the first target was destroyed, one of Hitler's own men called the FBI, and the invasion ended there.